My name is Syl Ko. I'm a writer and independent researcher. Within the context of this exhibit, I would summarize my research interest as why look at animals when humans do not want to look at each other? For the past year, I've been collaborating on a text with the author Lindgren Johnson, whose book Race Matters, Animal Matters was published in 2017. That same year, I co-authored with the writer Ko Afroism, which, like Lindgren's work, deals with the intertwined nature of race and animality. Lindgren and I initially collaborated in 2021 on an essay titled Recentering the Human. Our current project is a development on that essay. The theme that runs through our work concerns the presentation of the moral question about non-human animals. This question is one that asks about the propriety of our practices, customs, traditions, and rituals that involve the use of non-human animals, usually to their detriment, such as using them for food, scientific endeavors, entertainment, sport, companionship, and so on. In Afroism, Ko and I draw attention to how this question is commonly approached, which is to immediately reframe it as a question about the categorical moral divide assumed to exist between humans and all other animals. The assumption is that it is the drawing of this line that gives rise to animals' disparate treatment. So the debate surrounding the moral question about animals regarding the propriety of our practices involving them is transformed at the outset into one about whether that categorical moral division is legitimate. This is why you see massive amounts of empirical data and scientific research about human beings, and especially non-human animals, launched from each side of this debate. Those who defend practices like eating meat draw on and present data they believe prove that all or most non-human animals lack whatever it is that bestows upon humans unique moral consideration, thus justifying the moral line dividing humans from animals. Those who are critical of these practices involving animals will draw on and present data they believe prove that there is no capacity, characteristic unique to humans that would justify privileging human moral interests over other animals' interests if those animals share that same capacity or characteristic. Thus, they argue that the moral line is unjustified and ought to be eroded. Furthermore, they think to challenge these practices necessitates desanctifying humanists, meaning humans have bloated their status to mythic proportion by making their mere humanness, the mere belonging to the species Homo sapiens, the supreme value on the planet. So elevating animals or securing for them the moral recognition they deserve entails deflating the importance and centrality of humanness, and thus of human beings. And what often goes unspoken is that these sorts of debates are always very theoretical, as in literally beholden to ethical theories. Whatever the favored ethical theory designates as the special capacity or the special property that confers upon beings moral status will dictate whatever data each side of the debate will obsess over. For instance, if the theory proposes that the ability to suffer pain and enjoy pleasure is the property that qualifies one as morally considerable, each side will dig up and present data that evidences which animals feel pain, feel pleasure, to what degree, and so on. In the essay Recentering the Human, Lindgren and I push back on this debate's interpretation of what it means for there to exist a moral categorical line dividing humans from other animals. We express doubt that the having or the not having of some particular capacity or characteristic is relevant to this division, and we express even larger doubts that this division has much to do with the maintenance of the practices in question. We propose that this moral line dividing humans from other animals is fairly harmless insofar as non-human animals are concerned. It is simply the result of human beings situating themselves in their own species concept. Namely, it's just humans operating from their human perspective. It's not the sort of thing that requires justification. In other words, human beings can apprehend what a human is from two different perspectives. One is the perspective with which we apprehend all other animals. For instance, if you present me with a lineup of different animals, I can say, that is a bat, that is an elephant, that is a fish, that is a human, and so on. And I can make claims about each animal listed as I go down the line, which can be backed up with scientific data about each animal. Let's call this the external perspective of being human, or a species objectivist stance. We are not making any knowledge claims here with the term objective. We just mean we are observing humanness or being human from a third party, impartial angle, no different than how we observe batness or elephantness. However, something happens when we arrive at human in the species lineup that does not happen with any other species category. A second perspective opens up to us because we're humans. So a perspectival shift occurs from that is a human to I am a human, or the identification with one's own species. And with that shift comes a shift in the type of information you have access to. The internal perspective of being human, or what we call the species subjectivist perspective, is a vantage point I cannot apprehend for any other animal, and about which I must remain silent with regard to any other animal. While it's true that I know other animals experience a variety of emotions, enjoy pleasure and suffer pain, remember, imagine, have sophisticated social lives and relations, and so on, I'm unable to access the interiority of what these experiences are like from their perspective or for them. Even if we can empathize with animals and can know the intricacies of their lives to a certain degree, we cannot subjectively experience their vantage point. And by the way, for those of you wondering whether this reasoning applies to other categories like race or sex and so on, please email me so that I can explain why species membership is not like those categories. Lindgren and I argue that the transformation of the moral question about animals to this other question about the legitimacy of the moral divide between human beings and all other animals is entirely uncalled for and unnecessary, especially if you are challenging practices that harm animals. That's because the moral question about animals is one that originates from the human internal or species subjective perspective, while the ensuing reframed debate is playing out at the human external or species objectivist perspective. To make this clear, let's look at an example. Imagine you move to a new town and you ask your neighbor for the route to your new job, which starts tomorrow. The neighbor disappears into his office and you hear a printer hard at work back there. The neighbor reemerges with an astounding large printout of the dazzling famous blue marble photo of Earth taken by the Apollo 17 crew. But of course, this image will not do. Despite the printout's large size, grand detail and beauty, not to mention that the neighbor threw in a few impressive current scientific metrics charitably on the side, your question is better answered by a vastly different kind of image of Earth, such as the perspective of being on Earth, like Google Maps. The misguided neighbor may have provided you with the most scientifically and cosmically accurate portrayal of Earth, and you may even understand his eagerness to share the picture with you, given the enormity and beauty of what is displayed, the many numbers to ponder and drown into, the various thoughts provoked by apprehending our home from a perspective that is without. But ultimately, your question cannot be answered or even addressed from this distant conception of Earth. For what you are seeking concerns what is on Earth, including the routes and paths we pave, the buildings we construct, the transportation services we devise, and the ideas that frame these entities like towns, cities, streets, bus lines, and so on. Your question is a local question for which one requires a local conception of Earth to answer, let alone to make the question itself intelligible. Like this example shows, we create parameters for what our life should look like from the perspective at which we actually live out that life. And a large fraction of those parameters for what we think our life should look like is what we call human morality, or guidelines for how human beings ought to live and flourish in that life. The existence of the entire animal rights movement presupposes that this moral divide is intact because it is our humanness understood in the subjective sense to which animal rights advocates ultimately appeal. From the species objectivist perspective, the animal rights mission makes little sense. From that perspective, all humans are animals, but lots of animals eat other animals all the time, and they harm other animals all the time. It benefits them. The meat probably tastes good to them. So why is it a moral issue when humans do it? This kind of question can only be answered from the species subjectivist perspective, which requires metaphorically standing in the shoes of a human and apprehending oneself as distinct from all other animals. This gesture is not one of superiority, but an acknowledgement that being subject to the dictates of human morality is the responsibility of human beings and human beings alone. Our earlier works and our current project serve as examples for how we can use the species subjective perspective to think through the moral question about animals and challenge practices that harm them. In our earlier works, we discuss systematic human injustices, the human isms, such as racism, sexism, antisemitism, homophobia, ableism, and so on, alongside injustices inflicted by humans upon other animals. We place these phenomena on the same analytical plane, but not to compare them and certainly not to pretend they are similar. Rather, we do so to demonstrate how they are very distinct forms of suffering, and that acknowledging that distinction does not belittle animal suffering. To the contrary, it honors how remarkably unique that terror must be for those animals experiencing entire lives of subjugation and horror without even a map to the interiority or motives of those who crush them. When we set systematic human injustice beside systematic animal injustice, the mechanism underlying human injustice becomes salient. Despite the differences inherent in the various human isms, what they share is their purpose: to systematically and at the level of definition exclude certain human beings from the very concept of human. In some cases, this is made explicit. In other cases, it's not. But most human societies, if not all, operate and depend on a social organizing principle that sorts its human members along degrees of humanity according to the ideals of that society, from human with a capital H, top rank humans, down to humans considered not human, subhuman, animal. This is not merely a divisive tool, but is fundamental to each human society as it establishes what exemplifies the ideal human being versus what exemplifies the opposite of that ideal. So it is here in the human, not human divide, internal to human social worlds and specific to human life, that the idea of human and not human, or human and animal, as opposites or contraries is devised. This is key. Human beings marked as not human or less than human represent the living embodiment of the antithesis of humanity for that society. They are regarded morally illegible. So they play a very important role because higher ranked human beings cannot live out or play out their superiority without other human beings to subjugate, to serve as witnesses to this human order, to fail so spectacularly at their capital H humanity that their failure is a priori, to speak the words and testify about a reality in accordance with their master's desires. Only other human beings can fulfill this anti-capital H human function. This parasitic relationship transcends the physical. Although the so-called real or true humans rely on the labor and bodies of the dehumanized humans, more importantly, both groups are subjectively overridden or socially conditioned to experience themselves and others within the terms of this social order. The so-called true humans are buoyant and full of themselves, feeding off not just the physical and emotional trauma endured by dehumanized human beings, but by and large, they feed off the latter's psychic pain resulting from dehumanization and the internalization of their inferiority. If being human or if being considered human matters so much in cases where only human beings are involved, then humanness, insofar as we understand it in the gross sense, as the mere belonging to the species Homo sapiens, seems not valued at the level of society. In fact, it appears that when humans build and shape their societies, they go out of their way to ensure that the morally operative conception of human is not simply belonging to the species Homo sapiens. So, animal rights advocates calling to desanctify humanists, it's not a project as radical as they think, given this is what humans have been doing since establishing large scale societies a long, long, long time ago. In closing, our works suggest that the question about animal moral status should be repositioned within this larger problem surrounding the open question about human moral status or the status of humanness. That is, the situation of animals seems to be a byproduct of the schema internal to human worlds that's primarily designed to devalue humanness, this social human animal divide. It's not that humans are more important than non-human animals, and that's why we want to focus on the internal human world here. Rather, animal injustice is reflective of what appears to be a larger moral crisis occurring within the human and within human societies, a crisis that has unfortunately been normalized. So we believe the schema underlying this crisis, our devaluation of humanness, which is our own condition, by the way, may also prevent the possibility of our valuing any other form of life at the widespread societal level. Which brings us back to our opening question. Why look at animals when we humans do not want to look at each other? And this is where our current project picks up. Thank you.